People are dropping in. Right. Welcome to East Asia Foundation and the Quincy Institute's panel discussion on South Korea's legislative elections and implications for U.S. South Korea relations. My name is Trita Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward rigorous diplomacy. It's been a rocky past few years for U.S.-South Korea relations, though President Moon Jae-in played a crucial role in making Trump's diplomacy with North Korea possible. Tensions later grew as Trump demanded a drastically altered cost-sharing arrangement for U.S. troops to be able to remain stationed in South Korea. With President Moon and his coalition's landslide victory in the recent parliamentary elections, his position has now significantly strengthened. How will he use that to address the remaining and outstanding issues in the U.S.-South Korea relationship, such as the special measures agreement, as well as diplomacy with North Korea that currently is at a deadlock stage but can be revived? And how will South Korea be affected, and how will it react to the rising tensions between Beijing and Washington? We have an excellent panel here tonight that will help us address all of these different issues. And our moderator is QI's own Jess Lee, who has worked extensively on U.S.-South Korea relations. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, as always, please ask your questions using the Q&A function at Zoom, and we will get to them throughout this conversation. And if you are watching this on YouTube, please ask your questions using the comment section on YouTube. So without any further ado, please welcome Jessica Lee, who will introduce the panel and lead the conversation. Jessica?
Great, thank you so much, Trita. Good evening to those of you who are dialing in from the East Coast, like Trita and myself, and good afternoon to Congressman Bera, of course, and good morning to all of you in South Korea. Thank you so much for dialing in and watching this conversation and being part of it. On April 15th, South Korea held one of the world's first national elections during the coronavirus pandemic, and the voter turnout was 66.2%, the highest turnout for South Korea's legislative election in almost 30 years. This was a decisive win for South Korean President Moon Jae-in and his party, the Democratic Party. They now control 180 out of 300 seats in the unicameral National Assembly, making it the first time in 16 years that left-leaning parties have secured a parliamentary majority in South Korea. Because the Democratic Party now holds 3/5 of the seats in the parliament, the party has the power to stop filibusters and can fast-track certain new legislation, if 3/5 of the assembly agrees to it. So what are the implications of the National Assembly election results on U.S.-South Korea relations? How will it impact the conflict with North Korea? And how does South Korea see the rising tensions between the United States and China? Here to answer these questions and many more are our three distinguished panelists. Congressman Ami Bera has represented California's 7th Congressional District in the House of Representatives since 2013. Congressman Bera is currently a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and he serves as the chairman of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, and Nonproliferation. He is also the co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Korea. Ambassador Sung-hwan Kim was a career diplomat and served as a Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of the Republic of Korea from October 2010 to March 2013. With a career spanning over 36 years, he's held a number of senior diplomatic posts, including as ambassador to Austria, Uzbekistan, and as a permanent representative to the international organizations in Vienna. After retiring from the Foreign Service, Ambassador Kim has been engaging with a number of academic institutions and think tanks, including with Hanyang University, and as the chairman of the East Asia Foundation that is co-hosting this event today. And last but certainly not least, Professor Chung-in is a special advisor to the South Korean President for Unification and National Security Affairs. He has served as an advisor to various agencies within the South Korean government, including on the National Security Council, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Unification, and the National Intelligence Service. He has served as Ambassador for International Security Affairs of the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and as Chairman of the Presidential Committee on Northeast Asian Cooperation Initiative, a cabinet-level post. So it's a pleasure to have all of you here today. Let me first turn to Chairman Ami Bera. One question that I think is on a lot of our viewers' mind is the special measures agreement that Trita mentioned, the cost sharing agreement between Washington and Seoul, which has proven to be a major challenge in bilateral relations. And the two sides seem very far apart in terms of being able to reach a deal. Last I heard, US position was that Seoul needed to increase its payment by 300%, whereas South Koreans are entertaining a mere 13% increase over a 5-year period. So how do you see the negotiations, the SMA negotiations, from your perspective on Capitol Hill here in Washington? And do you feel like members of Congress are kind of getting enough information as to the strategy and the objectives that are part of the US position?
Certainly, members on my subcommittee have stayed engaged, and we've met with our counterparts from Korea, as well as engaged the administration. We recognize how important this alliance and friendship is, and this partnership that has served both countries' interests and the security of the region very well. So it's not just that, this is a partnership, and our hope, our hope was prior to the April expiration and having to lay off individuals that we would have come to some agreement. Short of that, when the pandemic hit, we asked for an extension to keep the current agreement in place while negotiations could continue. Obviously, the President Trump has a unique negotiating style, and the hope would be at the end of the day, we find a middle ground here that is acceptable to both the Korean people as well as the Trump administration. But by no means, and I think I can speak in a bipartisan way for most of Congress, we don't want to see this arrangement fall apart. We want to continue the partnership and certainly extend the partnership. We think it serves to keep peace on the peninsula and peace in the region. And for a while there, the hope would be after the Korean elections, then the negotiations would jumpstart. Again, I think the coronavirus pandemic, the global pandemic, probably has been disruptive, but I do think it's time to get the negotiations up and started again.
Ambassador Kim, I'd love to get your thoughts on the SMA as well. As a former foreign minister, you've obviously dealt with a number of bilateral issues in the foreign ministry. So what are your thoughts on the SMA negotiations and other elements of the bilateral relations that you think are critical at this stage?
Thank you, Jessica. And before I give my answer to your question, on behalf of the East Asia Foundation, I wish to express my thanks to Quincy Institute and Trita Parsi and Jessica for organizing this wonderful webinar. And I also wish to express my special thanks to Chairman Army Bera and Professor Chung-in for participating in this seminar. Well, regarding this SMA and our bilateral relations, as we know, our bilateral relations are basically based on security alliance, economic interests, and shared values. And for the last 7 decades, we addressed many challenges, and situation in the region and global level has always been changing. So we have to address that as well. And we consolidated our strong base of cooperation. So what I want to tell you is that we have a strong tradition of resolving bilateral issues through close consultation and coordination. For example, in the wake of this coronavirus outbreak, 180 countries have banned or restricted the entry of Koreans, but both the US and Korea neither issued a blanket entry ban nor put in place restrictions for each other. So I think so long as our spirit of mutual respect and trust can be maintained, I'm quite optimistic that our two governments will find a way forward on SMA and other bilateral issues like Afghan transition. Furthermore, as you mentioned, our president has now strong backing from the National Assembly. So once our two governments agree on these issues, it means our President Moon, he decides, then National Assembly will fully support President Moon's decision. And just Chairman Bera said, negotiation style of President Trump. Now, Korean people, we know the working style of President Trump and his negotiation style. So I think so long as he does not make situation on the Korean Peninsula unstable, for example, by returning to fire and fury in dealing with North Korea, his aggressive attitude toward Korea will not pose any specific hindrance to our bilateral relations. And through my experience, I think this SMA will be settled to our both satisfaction for both our countries. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'd like to bring Professor Moon into this conversation. You know, we have talked about this, Professor Moon, in your visits to Washington, and you've written about this. And, you know, we want to get to North Korea as well, which you've written extensively on as well. But, you know, what are your thoughts on the SMA negotiations and its status? And, you know, if I can add to that, you know, as some have said, you know, President Trump has been unnecessarily, in some respect, aggressive in dealing with South Koreans on the SMA. But does this impasse nevertheless provide an opportunity for both the United States and South Korea to redefine their relationship that is forward-thinking and more appropriate to 21st century needs as opposed to being stuck in the 1950s? So we'd love to get your thoughts.
Since this session is dealing with implications of the April general election in South Korea, and as Jessica mentioned, now the ruling party now has 180 seats in the National Assembly, and therefore the ruling party will have great influence over the issue of the SMA negotiation with the United States. The way I read among the members of the ruling party on SMA, they raise three fundamental questions. First question, the score. SMA is all about the paying wages for Koreans hired at American military base and supporting American military construction and supporting American the logistic support of the American military forces in South Korea. But as it turned out, that the American government seems to be wanting items other than those three functional areas defined by SMA. Therefore, members of the ruling party are raising the questions about the validity of that kind of American claim. Second is about the rate of increase. As you point out, increasing, by 300%, they cannot accept. And third one is about the so-called duration of this SMA. In the past, since 1994, every 5 years, the U.S. and Republic of Korea agreed to renew this SMA agreement. But the American government is saying that we want every year negotiation over the rate of increase every year. Now, members of the ruling party are raising those three fundamental questions, and particularly, majority of the ruling party members argue that without amending SMA, it is virtually impossible for the National Assembly to approve any kind of negotiation by our foreign ministry and the State Department. If we really want U.S. want items other than those three functional areas, then they got to be amendment of SMA, and then rectify the SMA at the National Assembly in Korea and U.S. Congress. Then we can talk about it. Therefore, I would say that the SMA negotiation will be much tougher.
If I could just add, I do think the professor's correct that you can't renegotiate this deal every year. At a minimum 5 years, because we have to project long-term friendship. We have to project the strength of the alliance, and that comes from agreements like this. And if it's every year, our adversaries or folks that we're negotiating with, you may send the wrong signals. And if we're looking at peace on the peninsula and a long-term negotiation with the North Koreans, they have to know that the United States and Republic of Korea are in this together and in this for the long haul. particularly for other regional security issues as well. So,
apart from the Congressman, Bera's point, there is another important point. In the case of Germany and Japan, yes, they do negotiate with the United States every year, but in their case, it is so-called the bottom-up case. But in the case of South Korea and the United States, every 5 years, but the lump sum top-down approach. That means what? We give $1 billion to American forces in South Korea. Then American forces in South Korea can use whatever they want to use without any further itemized, scrutinized examination of each item. That is why U.S. has accepted that kind of 5-year term approach. Therefore, if the United States change, okay, that kind of so-called the negotiation mode from the top-down lump sum approach to bottom-up scrutinized and itemized approach, maybe South Korean government may accept 1 year in a negotiation approach. Therefore, the United States in good terms because you don't have to negotiate every year, and you can spend the items as you see fit.
We see, yeah. If I add one more point, in the past, this SMA agreement was negotiated between State Department and the Foreign Ministry, but now President himself involved in this negotiation. So it has been politicized. So it makes this process very difficult. But as I said, I'm not that pessimistic about the concluding this year's agreement because both officials of the both governments, we know how to do that. Now it's up to the decision of the president, I think.
But let me just add one more point. Our National Assembly will be extremely tough on that issue. Therefore, they may not support President Moon Jae-in. If President Moon Jae-in shows, lukewarm approach toward the United States, therefore we have quite different, setting in the National Assembly. If the opposition, conservative opposition party, had a majority share in the National Assembly, that might have been much better for the fast, settlement of the SMA negotiation. But a totally different ball game in the National Assembly.
Yeah, and my concern, I feel optimistic that something will get done because Congress certainly wants to get something done. Historically, every other president would allow the State Department and the Foreign Ministry to negotiate this deal and then present the final deal to the respective presidents. My biggest fear is now with a U.S. presidential election coming up that U.S. politics may slow the process down. And I think that's where members of Congress with members of Parliament have to have an ongoing discussion. And so that when we do get close to a final deal, there's an agreement, at least from the congressional and parliamentarian side. And that's why I think that relationship is such an important relationship.
And I mean, Chairman Bera, you play a really critical role, both on the caucus, but as well as on the Congressional Study Group and in other settings where you're bringing members of Congress for dialogue and sharing information, which I think is critical because as you all noted, the legislative branch and the executive branch serve very different functions. So just because one party is in control of both branches of government doesn't mean that they get everything they want. That's not how it works. And so I think your points are well taken. In terms of other, challenges or maybe even opportunities for closer cooperation between U.S. and South Korea, I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about China and get your thoughts on how that might shape bilateral relations. As you know, there's growing concerns among South Koreans that it might be caught in the middle of a Cold War between China and the United States. Quincy scholars such as Rachel Odell and others have argued that a retributive approach toward China will cause a lot of harm and very little good, especially within the context of the global pandemic that we're living under right now. So, this question is for all of you. Are we well, first to Chairman Bera, I mean, do you think the United States has entered or will be entering a new Cold War with China? And if so, how do you think that will affect U.S. relations with South Korea?
So these are my opinions. I think the president uses a different language and different rhetoric. Again, my concern is U.S. domestic politics is influencing, the president's language and rhetoric. And what I mean by that is certainly China is not without fault within the pandemic. There was a lack of transparency early on. We couldn't get top scientists into Wuhan and into the hot zone. That's a fair criticism of the Chinese response. But this is a virus. It's not, it doesn't know your country of origin or your religion or whether you're a Democrat or Republican. It's a virus, and it's now impacting all of us. But given that we have a presidential election coming up, President Trump understands that his initial handling of this virus, again, my opinion, was slow. He didn't take control and leadership, and it's going to be very difficult for him to run on that. The lack of leadership in handling the initial phases of the virus. So he shifted the blame to say, well, it's China's fault. I don't think that will be successful, but it is complicating our diplomacy. Now, again, China is not without fault. Some of what China is now doing in Hong Kong, what they're doing with the Uyghur population, the autocratic moves that Xi Jinping has made, those all go against our values of democracy. Their lack of transparency in doing business, what they do with our intellectual property. Those are all fair criticisms, and those are places where we need to negotiate. And then their coercive practices. When we deployed THAAD batteries to protect in a defensive posture of the Republic of Korea, the retaliatory economic measures that China did, again, those are areas that I would hope to see improvement. But do I want us to go into a Cold War? No, I don't think it's in the US interest. I don't think it's in China's interest, and certainly it's not in the regional interest. Do I want us to take tough positions and push back? Absolutely. Do I want to, as all of us realize there's an overdependence of supply chain on a single source, in this case, China, do I want us to address redundancy and build capacity, especially, again, when we think about the current situation with the global pandemic? Until we have a safe and effective vaccine and can vaccinate 6 billion to 7 billion people around the world, we won't have defeated the virus. We'll continue to see flare-ups. That will take a global effort. And that's 12, 24, 48 months. Where can we create those partnerships where we work collaboratively as countries with shared values to effectively defeat this virus? And it's not a guarantee that the United States comes up with the vaccine, or Korea comes up with the vaccine first, or China comes up with the vaccine. So how do we negotiate that on the front end? I do worry about some of the Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, the importance of maritime security, freedom of navigation, is important to both Korea and the United States, as well as our partner nations in the region. And we should resolve these issues without having a direct confrontation. We should think about how we, as like-minded countries that value free market and democracy, can make sure these waterways are open and navigable. So we will be a competitor with China, no doubt, but we don't have to have a direct confrontation. I have no issue competing with other countries. That's fine. That often makes each country better and more efficient. But it's in no one's interest to have a confrontation, particularly a kinetic confrontation. And certainly, I'll close with this: the countries in the region, whether it's the Republic of Korea or Singapore or India, they can't choose the United States or China, nor will they, because I'm going to guess China is probably Korea's largest trading partner, and it won't be either or. So how do we find that middle ground where we're all able to work together and bring China into a more fair playing field?
We're starting to get some questions from the audience, which I'll start to loop in. But I want to give Ambassador Kim and Professor Moon a chance to talk about how China might affect South Korean government's priorities, foreign policy objectives, particularly related to the U.S.
Frankly, what I'm worried about the situation most is the strategic competition between the U.S. and China. And there are many challenges to our even alliance, but this is the most important factor nowadays, I think. And we have a very bitter experience of being retaliated by China after we deployed THAAD to uphold our alliance. So as burning child, there is a fire. Our business community is very much concerned about the possibility of recurrence of this situation. So for us, the most compelling issue is that we should avoid the recurrence of this kind of situation. But in reality, I mean, the exchange of words and trade war becomes more difficult and difficult. So I think in this situation, as Chairman Bera pointed out, some like-minded countries like Korea, Australia, we can jointly do something, but there is a limit, I think. But anyhow, we should do something to avoid at least recurrence of this kind of bad situation in this region.
But, you know, South Korea is an American ally, and we maintain strategic cooperative partnership with China. And obviously, alliance is more important than strategic partner. Okay? Therefore, for us, our number one priority on the US. But as Chairman Bera pointed out, we are so structurally dependent on China. China accounting for 24% of our total trade. United States 9%, Japan 7%. And also, if we antagonize China, China can pose a military threat to us, plus China can support North Korea. Then we'll really have a new Cold War on the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia. Therefore, our hope is this. We want to maintain good relations with both countries. Therefore, we are really hoping China, United States and China work together. Particularly, as Chairman Bera pointed out, the issues of pandemics, nuclear weapons proliferation, climate change. Unless those two superpowers, United States and China, cooperate each other, there's no hope for multilateral solution to the problem. All those global common problems cannot be solved without cooperation between the United States and China. I really hope that President Trump would give that kind of imperatives for bilateral cooperation between Beijing and Washington, and leading those two, G2 leading global cooperation to tackle the pandemics and nuclear non-proliferation and climate change.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and, go ahead. Sorry, Ambassador.
I'll just add really quick.
Oh.
I think Professor points out is, the pandemic does create an opportunity, a silver lining, because yes, we do think, in the fall and winter, we will see a resurgence of the virus in a second phase of this. We don't know what the future looks like, but we know we don't defeat this virus unless we all work together. And if we don't work together, it will take longer, more people will lose their lives, there will be more economic damage. So it's in the United States' interest, but it's in the world's interest for all of us to work together, to share information, to defeat the virus, and to set aside differences. We can come back and have tough negotiations on those, but right now we're talking about our economic livelihood and the true lives of our citizens.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to turn to the first question that we received earlier in the hour from Hiroyuki Akita, who I believe is the commentator from Nikkei, if I'm not mistaken. His question is about the SMA negotiation. He wanted to know if the U.S., if it is in fact true that the U.S. has included maintenance cost of nuclear umbrella to defend South Korea? And secondly, whether will the US request other allies such as Japan and Australia, NATO members, et cetera, to bear the cost of a nuclear umbrella as well? I don't know, Chairman Bera, if you have any thoughts on that.
I don't know the answer to that specific piece. I can tell you fundamentally, the nuclear umbrella serves the US purposes as well for non-proliferation and sharing that. So I would not ask our allies and friends around the world to offset the cost of the nuclear umbrella. It serves our purposes as well, and our strategic interests in the United States.
Okay, excellent. I'll move on to the second question, which is for Chairman Bera, actually. This is from Hyun Lee from Women Cross DMZ. She's asking, I'm very sorry for the siren in the background. Okay. She was asking, regarding the Indo-Pacific Command's request of $20 billion over the next 5 years for Asia Pivot 2.0. She thinks that will just continue sort of the Cold War divisions and only increase the possibility of arms race in Asia. Will you use your power to oppose that increase?
We'll take a look at that increase. We do certainly have some concerns about the maritime security and freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific region. I think a better approach is, working with our like-minded allies, such as the Republic of Korea, Japan, Australia, India, to try to set a framework where we have the rule of law and open waterways. Again, direct confrontation won't help anyone. It'll actually hurt everyone in the region. I also, had you asked me 3 years ago this strategy, I would have said, we would have passed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was not just a tool of commerce, but it was a tool to set a framework for the movement of goods and services. And then, we would have created space for Korea to join in this trading bloc, so we could set the rules of commerce and movement of goods and services for the 21st century, which I think would have benefited all countries, including China, which I would have guessed at some point would have joined as well. And countries that trade together and work together sometimes have different mechanisms to resolve conflicts. Great.
Well, the next question is on China, and it's directed to our experts in South Korea. But Chairman Bera, you can also weigh in, of course. This one is from Benjamin Engel. Related to Korea-China relations, yesterday the South Korean media reported that Beijing had informed Seoul of the contents of the new national security law for Hong Kong, essentially seeking Seoul's approval for the law and the end of Hong Kong autonomy. On the other side, the US is taking a stance against the law. So how can South Korea straddle this divide over Hong Kong? Can South Korea support democracy in Hong Kong while simultaneously avoiding backlash from the CCP, such as what was witnessed during the THAAD issue?
I haven't heard about it, okay? But our government will give a very prudent deliberation if China going to explain it, But anyhow, the law is about the Chinese, internal, legal process. Therefore, it will be very difficult for us to make an, intervention. However, if the law really violates the universal principles of human rights, and I think the South Korean government may take, some critical position. But I would say that our government, I don't know whether our government has that kind of explanation from Beijing or from Washington, whatever. But if there is that kind of explanation, then our government will give a very prudent deliberation. But it will be much more prudent than any other foreign policy issues, because that issue will be very much closer to the internal affairs of China, because we approve one China policy. Okay, therefore it will be very difficult. It might put the South Korean government in a difficult position, but President Moon Jae-in has been championing, universal, human rights and etc. Therefore, he will be, looking at the issue from that angle.
Okay, Ambassador Kim, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah. I if I had one more thing is that when you look at that issue, we should look at from our own values and philosophy of how we should do that. As Professor Moon mentioned, our incumbent President Moon is the champion of human rights. So from that perspective, we should look into that issue. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Great. All right. We have a lot of other excellent questions that I want to get to. So let me just move on to the next one, which I think Professor Moon in particular will have a lot to say. So this question is from Herman Cohen, who is a former U.S. ambassador. He's asking, would U.S. normalization with Pyongyang be good for South Korea? Professor Moon, do you want to? Go ahead.
Earlier is better. That can be the really real starting point for the real negotiation for the denuclearization of North Korea. The American approach has always been, you denuclearize first, then we would come up with a set of incentives, such as sanction relief, peace treaty, and diplomatic normalization and whatever. But not only just agreement, if the United States really shows its intention to normalize diplomatic ties with North Korea and exchange embassies and whatever, then it will be extremely difficult for North Korea to justify the possession of nuclear weapons because they have been chanting security assurance from Washington. What else would be more than the diplomatic normalization in terms of security assurance? Therefore, I would say that would be great impetus for any kind of further negotiation for denuclearization of North Korea.
Ambassador Kim, did you want to weigh in?
Yes, but North Korea, they always want to talk only with the United States and not with the South. So our government now, as far as I know, is very much anxious to have talks with the North, but in the short term, I'm not that optimistic about that because as Professor Moon said, the earlier the better. Everybody knows that, but North Korean position, we should think about that. And personally, I think until the prospect for next president for the United States is clear, then North Korea may not come to the dialogue with the US or with South Korean government.
Chairman Bera, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. I've actually written extensively about a need for at least liaison office level communication between the United States and North Korea to break the gridlock and what is apparently clearly been, a very difficult diplomatic process. And so, some who are opposed to that idea, though, would say, well, we can't, reward North Korea with a liaison office, let alone an embassy. But clearly there is, some rational explanation for wanting greater and steadier communication. So how do you see this issue regarding normalization?
I mean, a couple of things. I mean, considering where we were a year ago and where we are today, I agree with the ambassador. I think, in the midst of a U.S. presidential election, I don't think, the North Koreans will be willing to engage much. And in fact, as their history has suggested, during election season, they often will exhibit some bad behavior. That said, either if President Trump's reelected or if Vice President Biden is coming in, I've been a proponent of the dialogue and negotiation. Again, it's better than the days of fire and fury when we were worried that we were on the verge of a war that no one would have benefited from and certainly would have impacted the people of Korea greatly. But, so dialogue's always better. I do think, again, these are my opinions, but if we're thinking about denuclearization on the peninsula, that's not the starting point, that's probably the ending point, because there's no start where Kim Jong-un is going to denuclearize, because now he has no leverage moving forward. But if you agree that that's the end goal, and it may take a decade or two to get to that end goal, then can you work backwards and say, what are the steps that it would take to get to that end goal? And those may be very small first steps to build some trust. It may be some steps towards denuclearization. It may be some steps towards, restoring some economic stability. Because I also think North Korea has to see that it's in their interest. Again, we have to be able to take a multi-decadal view, not just a few years. It'll be 10, 20, 30 years. But where could they be 30 years from now? Where could the regime be, but where could the people be as well? And I'm not talking about reunification, but there could be a very cooperative partnership. North Korea, while it doesn't have much of economy, it does have natural resources. And if we just look at the Korean experience, where South Korea was 40 years ago and where it is today, anything's possible with long-term sustained engagement. That's the best case scenario. I don't think we're there yet, but I do think there's a role to the extent possible. Obviously President Moon has wanted to engage the North Koreans, and they do show an inclination that they just want to deal with the United States. But maybe the Republic of Korea can keep, not let things slide too much further back, because we're a lot further away than we were a year ago. And maybe there's that opportunity with a new American president coming in to re-engage that dialogue, or President Trump post an election may say, okay, let me think about what my legacy can be. And maybe, he genuinely seemed to want to get something done. I worry sometimes that he'll give too much away too quickly and get little in return.
So we're.
Can I
go ahead.
Here? Really, as Chairman Bera pointed out, the dialogue is better than confrontation. And also, let me just emphasize one more point. You may recall B.H. Skinner, the behavioral psychologist at Harvard. He used to argue that the positive reinforcement is always better than negative reinforcement. American approach on North Korea has been always based on the concept of negative reinforcement. But given Dr. Skinner's experiment, positive reinforcement is much better in changing and modifying behavior of child. Of course, I'm not comparing North Korea with child, but what I'm saying is this: really think about you come up with a more positive attitude toward North Korea, with a set of incentive. Of course, that should be based on so-called simultaneous exchange between denuclearization and recognition, peace, and other kinds of incentives. Therefore, there has to be some kinds of realignment, philosophical realignment of American approach toward North Korea. Because once you demonize North Korea, we try to, really topple North Korean regime, isolate, contain North Korean regime. I really don't think that North Korea will, yield to the American demand. Therefore, there got to be some philosophical, readjustment in the United States.
Yeah, I would agree that, this trading of insults back and forth between Kim Jong-un and President Trump doesn't benefit anyone. If he wants to insult us, our ego has to be bigger than, we're the United States of America. That doesn't matter. Let's still get to the end point, which is, how do we create peace and stability in the region? And in my mind, that is, again, taking a longer view towards denuclearization, but also towards economic development in the North. And again, I don't know what that partnership between the North and South looks like. I wouldn't set reunification as a goal, but that's up to the North and the South to decide. If that's in their best interest. That's up to the people to decide.
I want to bring in William Gallo from Voice of America in Seoul, who's asking this question. Can Ambassador Kim and Dr. Moon briefly comment on how the current South Korean administration would handle a Biden presidency, both in terms of the alliance and also in terms of the North Korean negotiations?
Well, I mean, the President Moon, now he has, based upon this strong showing in the National Assembly election, he wants to have his legacy. And his legacy will be on how to improve our relations with the North. So in the coming years, I think this government will focus on how to improve our relations with the North. So, but the final outcome, we have to wait and see.
I agree with Ambassador, the Minister Kim. It all depends what kind of policy Joe Biden is going to pursue. If he's going to continue, President Obama's strategic patience policy on North Korea, the President Moon Jae-in might not happy with that one. If President, elect, Joe Biden pursues, engagement with North Korea, dialogue with North Korea, positive, reinforcement toward North Korea, then President Moon Jae-in will welcome. Therefore, in other words, they do not know each other personally, okay? As President Moon didn't know about the President Trump. But what really matters is what would be the contents of Joe Biden's policy on North Korea and the Korean Peninsula and toward Northeast Asia. Therefore, policy matters rather than just the character of a new leadership in the United States.
If I may add just one thing is that we remember that it's already a long time, or 20 years ago, when there was a Democratic government led by President Clinton, there was a moment of almost reaching diplomatic relations between North Korea and United States. They agreed to establish liaison offices in both capitals, but I mean, it has not been realized. So I think Democratic government in the past, they had that kind of forward-looking attitude toward North Korea. So at the moment, we don't know about Joe Biden's platform or his campaign slogans, but on North Korea, but and also Korean Peninsula. So we remember the experience of Democratic government did toward North Korea. So we hope that is our hope again.
And if I were just to add, well, I can't speak for Vice President Biden, but as one of his top supporters and someone who's working hard to get him elected, I think we can look at his 36 years in the Senate and 8 years as vice president. And certainly he's been a champion of non-proliferation and looking at a reduction of the world's nuclear arsenal. He's been a believer in setting the frameworks of these treaties. And so I think that would be his natural inclination. At a time where, and unfortunately, I disagree with what President Trump's doing, where he's pulling out of multiple treaties that I think will make us less safe, and hopefully does not trigger another nuclear arms race. That I think that's not in anyone's interest. In the 21st century, we should be working in the opposite direction.
I want to get back to the issue of the SMA, because I think in so many ways the negotiations have really unearthed a lot of questions about the assumptions we make, in U.S. South Korea alliance. And so, some have argued that President Trump's unrealistic demands on SMA could really fuel calls within South Korea for reducing U.S. forces, troops, and military presence in South Korea, as Chairman Bera alluded to at the beginning of the call. And I myself have written about, the need to rethink U.S.'s defense priorities on the Korean Peninsula toward a grand strategy of restraint, which could include over, a long period of time, gradual reduction of U.S. troops on the peninsula. So, perhaps to Professor Moon and Ambassador Kim, is there appetite within South Korea for a greater degree of self-reliance?
Given the Chinese rise and the continuing North Korean military threat, grand majority of South Korean population support ROK-US alliance, and great majority of South Koreans support the continuing presence of American forces in South Korea. But if the American government has to reduce its forces in South Korea for whatever reasons, then they're hoping that we cannot really, prevent the U.S. from, making that kind of decision and implementing the decision. But if that situation comes, a lot of people hope that there would be some kinds of linkage between gradual reduction of American forces in South Korea, ground forces in South Korea, to denuclearization of North Korea. If, in other words, a gradual reduction of American forces in South Korea can be used as some kinds of bargaining card for the faster implementation of denuclearization of North Korea. Therefore, that is what Jessica, you raised in your article. Therefore, I think that is good. There will be support, but at the bottom line, I would say the great majority of the South Korean population, regardless of conservative or middle of the road, some middle of the left, at the left of the middle, they would support the continuing presence of American forces in South Korea.
Well, you see, this troop reduction is very sensitive issue in Korea. And we remember that President Carter, during his election campaign, he raised this issue and it has not been realized, and there was a strong resistance to troop reduction, both inside U.S. military circle and also from Korean side. So I think issues related with the alliance like troop reduction, it should be decided by assessing the overall defense capability of Korea and also political situation in the region, and not by the specific issues, I think. Yeah.
But let me add one more point. If that happens, then as Jessica, you pointed out, that there might be major strategic realignment on the Korean Peninsula in Northeast Asia. And because that will be seen as a kind of signal that the US is willing to decouple from the Korean Peninsula or disengage from the Korean Peninsula, then what should be the choice for South Koreans? Then that will trigger immense internal debate on the future strategic posture of South Korea. Therefore, you should keep that in mind.
If I could just add from the American perspective, I really do think that would be a move in the wrong direction. It would send a signal to the region that the U.S. is no longer fully engaged, and then you talked about the nuclear umbrella question. All of a sudden, you have a nuclear weapon state in North Korea and China. It's not as though South Korea doesn't have the ability to create nuclear capabilities. They've chosen not to do it. Well, if South Korea starts to say, well, for our own safety and protection and deterrence, we now need to acquire nuclear capabilities. Japan has the capabilities as well to do this. And that's the last thing we want. It's not in any one of our interests for the region to see that. So, there has to be a stability in this partnership. It may be different than it was in the past. And, I know we're coming up on the end, but if I frame global policy from my perspective, post World War II, post the Korean War, the United States really did have to step up and help rebuild Europe, help rebuild Japan, help partner with and rebuild Korea. Those created stable democracies, those created thriving economies, those created allies, and we can look back at the last 75 plus years and be proud of the stability that everything wasn't perfect, but in many ways the last 75 years in the history of the world were a period of peace and stability. The next 75 as we come out of this pandemic, and World War II was probably the last time where the entire planet was affected the way it was. When we come out of this, there will be different alliances. There will be different capabilities. Korea is not a developing nation. It's a top nation in the world, and it's a partner. What does that alliance look like? How do we partner with like-minded and like-valued nations to create a new security framework, not just in the Indo-Pacific region or in East Asia, but globally? And lastly, one foreign policy mistake I think we made in the post-World War II area, we had a Pacific strategy and there was an Atlantic strategy, but the two strategies never actually came together. And institutions that we put in place, like the United Nations and others, that may have made sense post-World War II, let's rethink what these global institutions and alliances look like in the 21st century post-pandemic. And we shouldn't be afraid to create new groups and organizations that would serve us well going forward in the 21st century.
Great. I am getting the cue that we have to wrap up because the Congressman has a kind of a hard stop in 5 minutes, but this has been a very enriching discussion. And I would just say, on Chairman Bera's last point, I think, part of what we're seeing, during the pandemic, and you as a medical doctor of all people, I think understand, the desire among American people, to have a more balanced U.S. government budget that really takes care of the people here at home as much as our interest abroad, and to not mindlessly pursue primacy everywhere, especially in places like Asia where we have wealthy, mature democracies like South Korea. I think at the very least, our elected officials owe it to the American people to have a debate around these issues, especially at this moment where resources are so constrained. So I think in that sense, the Quincy Institute and others who write about this topic, as Dr. Moon mentioned, this is a very sensitive topic, and it really goes to the crux of what the alliance is about and what it's there for. Can we let South Korea lead on more issues so that U.S. doesn't dominate unnecessarily and cause a misunderstanding? I mean, these are the types of questions around strategy that I think more people should be asking. And I hope we can continue to have conversations like this, because it really helps me to do my job better, to hear from people like you on the policymaking side. So now I'll turn over to my boss, Trita Parsi, to help us close this out. So over to you, Trita.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you so much, Congressman, Dr. Moon, Ambassador Kim. This was a fantastic conversation, truly enlightening. And as I think we saw, the relationship between the United States and South Korea is a very important one, but it is also going to be one that will be affected by many of the global changes that are taking place, that in some ways are inevitable. And being ahead of the curve and being able to proactively redefine them in a positive direction is going to be essential. And I think this conversation was tremendously valuable in highlighting some of the key elements and key questions that such a assessment is going to require. Before I let everyone go, I just wanted to give a quick reminder of the events that Quincy has coming up just in the next 2 weeks. On June 4th, we will be having a panel discussion assessing the Trump administration's maximum pressure strategy against Iran. It will be a conversation with Jared Blanc, who was an official in the Obama administration working on this issue, Iranian journalist Negar Mortazavi, as well as MIT professor Barry Posen, who has been one of the key architects of restraint. On June 11th, we will have a panel discussion on a new report that Quincy is publishing on how to end or how to wind down the war on terror. It's been authored by Steve Simon as well as Richard Sokolsky, and the panelists on that discussion will include Steve Simon, Ambassador Daniel Benjamin, Dr. Karen Greenberg, and Eric Schmidt from the New York Times will be moderating that conversation. Finally, on June 17th, we will host a discussion with QI fellow Patrick Porter on his new book, The False Promise of the Liberal Order: Nostalgia, Delusion, and the Rise of Trump. Again, thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't already, please go to quincyinst.org and sign up for our newsletter so that you will be able to get all notifications about all our panels and publications. And if we thank you so much for joining tonight, and hope to see you next week as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.